Welcome to this week's CASACADEMY. On behalf of our entire team in Toronto, we are so excited to welcome you, Christian. We have Christian Bourque, who's the Executive Vice President at Leger. Industry veteran, 25 years experience. Sorry, should I have been putting that out there?
No, I
proud of it. Proud of it. 25 years experience in public opinion, marketing research, and Christian heads up the research team in Leger's Montreal office. We're thrilled to have you here today. We have a little bit of a celebrity because Christian is also the company's spokesperson. So we're expecting a lot of glamour and polish from your presentation today. You regularly are commenting on political things in both the federal and provincial politics arena. You're a columnist on consumer trends on Radio-Canada. And in your spare time, you teach. Is that my understanding, teaching research methodologies at the University of Montreal? We are so honored that you are with us today sharing this proprietary research. I've had a chance to get a sneak peek, and I've already been shooting off some insights to clients saying, hey, have you thought of this? So welcome, Christian. I'm going to hand over the microphone. I know most people on the line are like, she's handing over the microphone. But I'm going to do that, and you can take it away with your presentation.
All right. Thank you first for the invite. I feel it's a privilege to be able to address you today and talk about what we found throughout the last 6 weeks of working through this crisis as a market researcher. Now, of course, I'm doing this from my oldest daughter's room because, of course, my wife gets the very nice office downstairs. So you don't need to really look at the background. So I'll flip it over directly into my presentation. That's a lot nicer to look at than me. So without further ado, you should be able to see my presentation now, and then we'll go into the presentation format. All right. So I think it's an understatement to say that this crisis has changed us. In many ways, what we're finding in the data that we're looking at, because our work in life is basically to try to make sense of data we collect among Canadians. And we've seen that from consumer behavior to some of our core values, to who we think we are, how confident we are in our economy, in ourselves. This crisis has really changed us. So for us, it was very important from the get-go to be involved in measuring how or what impact was the crisis having on our day-to-day behavior, but as well in terms of what's more at the core of who we are in terms of our values and attitudes towards each other and towards the crisis itself. We've been lucky at Leger throughout this crisis, and we've actually been extremely busy. We currently do a weekly national COVID-19 survey with the Association for Canadian Studies that we make public on our website. I'll give you the address at the end. You can upload our reports from the last 6 weeks, take a hard look at the data. Questions change from week to week as well to take into account what has changed in the crisis itself. So that has given us some very nice insights into Canadians, but also since we're doing it at the same time with a similar sample of Americans, we're able to compare how we fare against our southern neighbor. We've just finished as well the second wave of our consumer behavior syndicated study. A lot of the data that I'll be sharing today comes from that actual study. Now it's syndicated, so I can't say too much, but there's a lot of data to dig into. We're currently measuring about 50 different types of consumer behavior that may or may not have been impacted by the crisis to try to figure out when we're coming out of the crisis in a few weeks or months, nobody knows, how this or how these behaviors that people have adopted will stick with them or not once we come out of the worst of this crisis. We also do World Health Organization tracking in Canada for the Government of Canada. We're doing tracking on mental health and vulnerable Canadians with the Canadian Red Cross. We're doing as well the same COVID survey in the States I was just mentioning a few minutes ago. We do daily tracking for the Quebec government on COVID as well, the same that we're doing in Alberta as well through our Edmonton office. out there. So basically, we've been extremely sort of involved in measuring how this is impacting Canadians in many ways. So what I decided to do today is just to try to leave as many of the numbers out as possible. As a pollster, we tend to put too many numbers in presentations. I tried to take most of them out, but you'll see I was not that great at it. But anyways, so we'll try to get sort of a way at from the numbers themselves to sort of figure out how this will actually change our economy and will have an impact on your strategy as a brand or as an organization moving forward. So I'll be covering sort of 10 trends that I think we need to look for when we come out of this over the summer or the fall, and how these sort of trends might actually impact what we do in life. And I think these 10 trends that we're seeing now in the data should be having an impact on the decisions you're making now, because what you want to do is adapt to that change. Now, when we get out of this, money will still be there, maybe a little bit less than Canadians had coming into the crisis because of all that we've seen, but it's changing pockets. I mean, there are types of spending that people will get involved in more heavily, and some types of spending they'll want to get away from to a certain extent. And of course, this will have a deep impact on our business strategies. The first trend is the one that we expected. Now, this crisis has been a springboard for digital. We going into this and going into self-isolation early into the crisis, when we first went out with our consumer behavior study, the first thing we wanted to measure is to what extent people were transferring their sort of traditional brick and mortar retail into online activities. What we found though it was not the fact that more Canadians were doing it, was the actual sheer magnitude of the change. 55% of Canadians engage in at least one online purchase behavior for the first time, or we're doing it significantly more often than before the crisis. That's 1 out of every 2 Canadians who sort of basically found out that they could do, or they could purchase somewhere else or through a different channel than they have done before. Now, 55% is actually a lot. We've tested over 12 different ways that people can actually transact online since the crisis started. And to see that 1 out of every 2 Canadians is doing it more often or for the first time is sort of a staggering number, to say the least. And we've also seen that 18% of Canadians were actually transacting digitally during the crisis for the very first time in their lives. Now, will they go back to brick and mortar once the crisis is over? So far, what they're telling us in the data is that even though we've seen that there's been some delivery issues over the past few weeks, it's been harder for retailers to actually sort of follow the sheer volume of online transactions they were seeing. But regardless, 80% of Canadians say they're satisfied with this new mode of acquiring a product or a service that they're engaging in more often than they used to, or for the very first time. Now, with sort of a fairly high level of satisfaction in that sort of new way of transacting, you know, the bet is that some of the business volume we're seeing will be going online or digital over the next few months and coming out of the crisis, compared to what the situation would have been if it wasn't for COVID-19. So there is a change in how people will transact in the future. What we've measured throughout all of this is some types of transactions are seeing more growth than some others. I'll give you just one example. We're measuring now in wave 2, 25% of Canadians have taken a course or have taken some form of tutorial online, and it's a mode of acquiring or learning that they were not engaged with before the crisis itself. So for a lot of Canadians, e-learning is becoming now part of their lifestyle, something that was not happening before. Where we did not see that much difference before as opposed to now is, for example, transacting online with your bank has not really changed since the crisis has started. We were already sort of moving fast into online banking. But when it comes into these new types of behaviors, some people actually doing click and collect for the first time and being very satisfied with it. Some people actually grocery shopping online for the first time and being somewhat as well fairly satisfied with it. All of these behaviors will actually change how we transact. Now, does this mean that brick and mortar will suffer from the crisis? Well, I think brick and mortar, to some extent, those who were suffering coming into the crisis will suffer even more coming out of it. And the champions of retail will remain champions of retail in the brick and mortar space coming out of this as well. However, volume of transaction will have shifted. The other trend that will probably be very important coming out of this as well is if you take the propensity of people who now say they want to shop local more than they used to, and then they want to shop online more than they used to, that little independent store that did not think they needed an online or an omni-channel strategy before the crisis, well, guess what? Even though you're a local independent retail shop that people like to go to, you will need to have an online omni-channel strategy coming out of the crisis. So this first sort of trend, we kind of expected going into the COVID-19 crisis. What we've seen as well is a shift in what people buy more of or less of compared to before the crisis. One thing that I think we've all seen in our grocery stores is sort of the going back to basic ingredients, to the grocery staples that our mothers used to buy when we were growing up. For example, if you go to a Montreal grocer right now, you cannot find yeast. I've got now friends on social media telling you how to make your own yeast at home because you cannot find that anymore. Some people who I thought did not cook are basically making their own bread now. If you go to Vancouver, sometimes rice will be hard to find. So people are going back to staple products. Does this mean that we will see a shift or that we will see an impact in terms of how many sort of transform ready to go, ready to eat foods that will be that people will be buying in our grocery stores in a few months from now? That's left to be seen. However, there probably will be some move towards making it yourself that we were not seeing before the crisis itself. Of course, this will have some impact in terms of what we see on the shelves. It will have an impact also on our lifestyles at home. We've seen a dramatic increase, believe it or not, in health and beauty products. But what we've seen is all that is bath and body care have shot up quite dramatically in terms of purchase. Something that we may not have expected, because for many of us who just work from home all the time, well, there's that need to dress up and look great may not be as important as it was before the crisis. But however, taking care of ourselves is actually something we might be doing more of during this crisis as opposed to before. Of course, we're spending a lot more on disinfectant products. It just basically shows that the data we're collecting makes sense, because what people are spending more on, we actually see an uptake in our data. But of course, people are buying more disinfectant products. They're also buying more local. We'll get into that trend in a second and what it may mean for retail and as well for manufacturing moving on. We've seen an uptake in delivery service. A lot of people are, for the first time, ordering through the Uber Eats and the others that are available, even though Foodora just announced that they would be closing in Canada. There's been an uptake in drive-through and also in click and collect that we all expected as well. What's interesting about click and collect, though, is that people are extremely satisfied with that means of getting their goods from their grocer or any other retailer as well. So even though the trend pre-existed before the crisis, this will likely accelerate that trend. A third trend that we think will be extremely important coming out of this crisis, and I call it the sort of, it's cool to be frugal. If you remember back in 2008 and 2009, we saw a trend appearing in terms of how people were engaging with brands on social media and how they were actually trading secrets with their friends online. And in a way, it was kind of, it became during that or the last economic crisis before this one, it became almost cool to be cheap. And we might see this coming back again in 2020, with, of course, all that it may mean for who you are as a maker of a product or a brand or a retailer and so on. 32% of people in our sample said that they will reduce their spending on what they consider non-essential products and services. Now, deciding what is non-essential or essential is totally up to the consumers. But again, as a maker of those products, we need to, or we will need to be to convince consumers that we are an essential product in their lives. So that third of people who say they will reduce their spending on non-essential products is extremely important. What isn't is even more important is that this trend is even higher among two core targets, among women and among 25 to 30-year-old shoppers as well. And of course, women, and if you are a female between 25 and 34, you basically decide or will decide what is essential or not over the next couple of years. And I think sort of staying sort of in contact and trying to figure out to what extent you are delivering value and you are an essential product in people's lives will become extremely important. And this trend is similar to what we observed during the 2008-2009 crisis, is the willingness of consumers to trim down on certain aspects of their consumer spending that they felt was non-essential. Now, this cool to be cheap will have an impact that we were already sort of feeling. Like we've known over the past 8 to 10 years now that the mid-market is really what is suffering right now in our retail industry in Canada. Same in apparel, same in everything else. And we were seeing sort of this barbell phenomenon already, and it will accelerate. And that barbell phenomenon is moving forward, we'll see more players into the sort of lower end bargain, low price, commodity market sort of appearing, being very strong in that particular market. That $10, $15 tank top and so on and so forth. And at the other end of the market, we'll see those delivering high value, that's $1,000 Arc'teryx jacket, for example. And what will suffer will be that market in the middle. What we used to call the big mid-market for middle America, that used to be basically the core of the industry, will be pushed aside. And that's where the non-essential spending will likely disappear. It will go towards low-end, cheap bargain products. And we'll want to keep some spending for the high value for what we feel is essential to the experiences we want to live in our lives. But in the middle, people will be suffering. Now, this call to be frugal, which appeared in the last economic crisis, did not have the impact that I think our fourth trend will have. The fourth is probably Canadians, or what we're seeing in the data indicates that they will want to change their saving strategy moving forward. We all know the expression sort of saving for a rainy day. Well, it's been pouring for 6 weeks. For the first time, a lot of Canadians have needed to take a very hard look at their short-term savings and also at their long-term savings and figuring out what is their saving strategy. If Canadians decide to save more money, well, that's money they're probably taking away from spending on quote unquote non-essential products. So of course, this will have an impact on how we behave as consumers. And this all sort of, when we were in this people power shortage, where there were more jobs than people applying for them, and that people felt they could live from paycheck to paycheck because, you know what, tomorrow is going to be as great as today. Well, for the first time, this saving money just in case, well, we are living the just in case. And something will have clicked in people's minds that they probably will need to take a hard look on their saving strategy more than they have, and probably starting at a younger age. And we've seen in the past on research we've done with financial literacy and millennials that they do believe that they have a challenge when it comes to financial literacy, and they'll probably want to compensate that in the short to midterm. Of course, if you're a bank, this will sort of direct some of attention into how you should change your service offering. But as well, it may just mean that that money that is available to Canadians might end up in that long-term savings pocket that they probably were not considering before getting into this crisis. The other aspect of this as well that may actually, or people may connect in the future, we now know that about 85% of the people who are dying from COVID-19 are actually or were living in long-term care facilities across Canada. Now, your saving strategy will probably likely affect the quality of the service you will get from your long-term care facility if ever you have to go there. And I think Canadians will take a hard look at their savings moving forward in this crisis. A fifth trend that we are seeing that we kind of expected, and we saw it very early on with when we had the toilet paper gate very early in the crisis, fully a quarter of Canadians say they have adopted pantry loading during the crisis, and 16% are doing it for the first time. What's interesting about pantry loading as well is those adopting it are actually also 25 to 34-year-old people in Canada. So it's those younger Canadians who've never had to pantry load or never thought of pantry loading that are actually doing it for the first time. Will this last after the crisis? It all depends on how grocers and merchandisers decide to modify their pricing promotion strategies to sort of fit that new model, that new quarter of Canadians who now pantry load. Of course, this will be very much, there'll be sort of a new, an urban-rural divide. If you're living in Toronto, Vancouver, or Montreal in a 600-foot condo, of course, pantry loading is not even a consideration. But for a lot of Canadians out there, if this is the way they want to shop, we will see a change in grocers and general merchandisers' strategies coming out of this crisis that may affect exactly what we find on the shelves of our supermarkets. Now, this pantry loading, of course, is something that about 40% of Canadians said that they were pantry loading, or to some extent, before the crisis itself. Moving into the 60-some percent, well, this is becoming now sort of the mode of grocery shopping. And I'm looking forward to seeing to what extent, so far Canadians say that they like this way of doing things and they want to continue doing it after the crisis. We'll just have to wait and see to what extent they sort of follow through with that exactly. I'm thinking as well that this will have an impact on potentially some new forms of couponing which could become available to Canadian shoppers and that they might want to engage with if they as well do more of their grocery shopping or pre-shopping online compared to what they used to do before. Then new potential strategies for couponing are available to encourage people to pantry load at your grocery store as opposed to your competitors. All right, this buying local trend, we've heard tons of it. We've heard governments talking about it, government leaders talking about it, whether at the provincial or federal level. We've all seen stories in the paper of how Canadians say, well, this crisis has taught me that I should buy more local products. Fine. It's not the first time we hear this, but is this gonna stick? Right now at this moment, 16% of people, of Canadians in our survey said that they are actually buying more local products now than they were before the crisis. However, when you compare that to the 53% who say they intend to buy more local products because of the crisis, there's kind of a gap there. And that's the gap between, you know, talking the talk and walking the walk. Is that 16% going to grow and sort of move towards the 53, or is it going to stay at 16%, which of course has an impact, or a deep impact into where the money's going, but still is not sort of a mainstream phenomenon. But the more we actually move in or closer to that 53%, then we are talking about a major shift in the market. Currently though, already 1 in 8 Canadian shoppers say they are making an effort to buy more local product now during the crisis. Now, this is not an uncommon thing, although COVID-19 is the first time we've gone through this in our lifetimes. Every economic crisis produces the same protectionist streak that we are seeing now. So in fact, if Canadians feel that we are heading into a recession because of COVID-19, it's kind of normal that they would actually show this sort of behavior of being a bit more protectionist about where and what they buy. So this is not the first time that we are seeing it. However, because of psychologically, this COVID-19 is touching us differently. It's having a different impact on us than just another sort of recession that we've seen in the past. Will this actually exist into the future? One key example of this is what the Quebec government has launched about 4 weeks ago now. And as a response to the crisis, they've launched what they call the blue basket, le panier bleu, which is basically a very concerted strategy where all local retailers will be able to showcase their product offering or whatever they have to sell to Quebecers. And if you buy through the blue basket, or if you use the blue basket to purchase the product somewhere else, you can have a definite impact on shopping behavior. So that's one example where it may stick, at least for a while, or for the long term. But in order for people to maintain their habits of buying more local products, one, you either need to play on the heartstrings of climate change, which already for a certain number of consumers is having an impact on where they buy. But this was actually pre-COVID. Now, the ones that are switching now during COVID are the ones that were not necessarily swayed, or to that extent swayed by the climate change argument for buying local. So for them, which are not your early adopters, your trendsetters, but for your mainstream consumer, if you do not have a very structured campaign on featuring the fact that you are a local product and you are better than the competition, if we do not have improved signage into our retail space to basically showcase local products, if there is no concerted strategy at the industry level, can this trend really last? The seventh trend, which I think we are sort of looking at now, but we want to see what does it mean, maybe sort of pushing into the next 2 to 3 years, is the phenomenon of the staycation. This is what we measured this week. So far, 51% of Canadians say that they've actually changed their travel plans for 2020, of course, for obvious reasons, including a third that have actually canceled their travel plans for 2020. This includes a lot of us, for example, who with their airline company probably have credits that they can use for the next 2 years for another trip, and all of that we understand. There's only 8% of people who basically of Canadians who say, no, I'm sticking to the travel plans I already had. Now, those travel plans were maybe to travel to a cottage a couple of hours drive from their home, and they're maintaining those plans, so that's perfect. And 42% of Canadians said, we were not planning more vacation or vacations in 2020, which is largely coherent with what we have in different, roughly about 60% of Canadians travel outside of their region throughout the year. So this would be coherent. We then asked, are you likely to take or make new vacation plans for the remainder of 2020? This is among the 51% who say they had canceled their plans. Now, a majority of them say, yeah, it's very likely that I will make other plans. 21% who say it's somewhat likely. So most people who've had to cancel their travel plans are actually figuring out new travel plans for the remainder of 2020. And then some people say it's kind of unlikely or very unlikely that I will make new travel plans for the year. So we do have 3 out of 4 people who have had to change or cancel their travel plans who still plan to travel, which is kind of a good news. It kind of tells us in a way that as soon as they can resume their travel habits, they're more than likely to do so. But it may actually have an impact in terms of 2020 and moving into 2021, that the staycation will be what they want. We asked those who say that they were considering making travel plans for 2020. We said, well, how comfortable would you be in the context of coming out of this COVID-19 crisis? To what extent would you be comfortable taking a vacation that you can drive to rather than fly? This is where the staycation probably will become the norm for 2020, as we might have expected, and also outlines the fact that a lot of people will want to take a Canada-based vacation whether it's within their province or outside their province, but certainly one they can drive to is likely where they will need to go. Only a third are actually will want to stay at a resort or a hotel. So there still is a lot of convincing coming out of this that yes, you can take the 2-3 hour drive to stay at my resort or hotel. That will still be difficult. There'll still be some convincing to do. Only a fourth of people who say that they will feel comfortable flying in 2020. So if we thought that basically with my credits of the trip I'm not taking in June, if I would be taking it in September, well, the likelihood is I'm moving all those plans to at least 2021. And that's what a lot of Canadians are telling us right now. Only a quarter say they would be likely in 2020 to take a vacation abroad. So again, they're pushing everything into 2021 already. Renting or buying timeshare is something they're not really considering. And again, I always like to be sort of captain evidence here, but not a lot of people want to go on a cruise right now, or for the remainder of 2020. You know, that term staycation was actually coined during the last economic recession that we were talking about a bit early on. And it was coined in the States where people basically could not afford to take a vacation or a trip abroad and decided they would take a staycation. And this likely is the norm for 2020 and probably will have an impact on 2021 as well. If there is a second wave, if people fear a second wave, if there is no vaccine heading into 2021, staycation is probably what we should expect for the summer of 2021 as well. This, of course, poses a challenge for our airline industry, who already is facing something that none of them as executives have ever faced in their lifetimes or expected to face it in their lifetime. But the local festival, that nice resort near the lake, all of these will become extraordinary opportunities over the next 6 to 18 months. And there is certainly for our local tourist industry, they will need to focus hard on communicating to Canadians that staying in Canada is the greatest thing to do right now. Already Canadians will be open to it, more comfortable about it, and it's just a matter of how they actually move their marketing money away from attracting foreigners into Canada and try to replace some of that lost demand with sort of Canadians wanting to take a staycation for 2020 or 2021. So as much as we are seeing our tourist industry being struck right now by what's going on, coming out of this, it might be just a matter of seeing how we can shift marketing budgets around to try to maximize the number of Canadians we can attract to stay in our beautiful country. The eighth trend, which I think will impact all of us, regardless of what we sell as a product, as a service, and about who we are and how we present ourselves as a brand, is what I feel is we are entering into the trust economy. And what I mean by trust economy, I don't mean trust in the sense or in the financial sense, but in the sense of going into this crisis. It's been 25 years that I grew up with political science. I'm a political science graduate. All that we were talking about is the growing cynicism, and people were disengaged with their communities. People lacked faith in their institutions. People had given up on our political elites, that people felt less and less engaged with their, both at the national, provincial, or even at the local level. And that our traditional way of talking to each other through our political system was basically becoming more and more problematic. Well, guess what? Going into this crisis, all of us, almost 100% of us, basically decided to listen to what our institutions were telling us to do. I mean, it's been rather amazing. I never would have expected going into this crisis, because if we just remember the level of crap that we heard during the last federal election campaign, and all of the mud that was being slung around during that campaign, and how bad our politicians were, and you name it, we've heard all of it, that 6 months later, almost 100% of us as Canadians decided to do what our institutions were telling us to do. We've been measuring now for the past 6 weeks different types of behaviors, that basically our governments are telling us to engage in. And what you have here is the percentage of Canadians who say that they are doing this to the best of their ability compared to what we see in the United States. Now, we'll see evidence of that in a second, but traditionally, when you look at data, there's global data measuring trust out there. Canada is a high trust country. The US is a low trust country. And when you look at how people have been sort of basically listening to what our institutions are telling us to do, you see here the gap in terms of the percentage of Canadians who say they are social distancing versus Americans, who say they're keeping a safe distance when they are in contact with people compared to Americans. They wash their hands more frequently. They use their elbow when coughing or sneezing. That gap between us and the United States, and the same for stopping going out except for when necessary, and even sort of refraining from visiting friends and family, at the bottom there, the mask is something different and is less of a concern here. But for all of those, there is a significant gap between, I would say, more disciplined Canadians and slightly less disciplined Americans. And I believe that gap is fully explained by the level of trust we have in our institutions compared to the level of trust Americans have in their own. We've measured over the past few weeks as well the level of trust in different types of, let's call them authorities, in our respective countries. And again, you see the gaps between Canada versus the US. Do you trust your health professionals that you deal with in your life? That trust is higher, and almost 100% in Canada compared to the US. The extent to which you trust other Canadians, 87% of us trust each other. That's only, and if you look at the bottom at Americans, only 72% of Americans trust other Americans. Again, the gap is fairly large. We trust our public health officials much more than Americans do. We trust our police services much more than our southern neighbor. When we actually looked at the two chief medical officers in each country, Theresa Tam here versus Mr. Fossey in the States, the gap is a lot smaller. So both of them are very respected. And between you and I, we did not know these people before the crisis actually hit. Trust in the WHO is higher in Canada compared to the States, but of course here there is no campaign by our head of state to say that we should discredit the WHO, so that's probably explains the gap. We trust our banks more, and look at Justin Trudeau. Without getting into the politics of this, was barely elected as a minority government with 34% of the vote, yet today 56% of Canadians say they trust the man, compared to 51% of Americans who trust our prime minister, and we'll see the gap in a minute. Trust in the media is something that's always hard in both countries, actually. But look at how Americans trust Americans, and look at the bottom there. 38% of Americans trust their president versus 56% of us who trust our prime minister. Now, the difference between the two is probably the extent to which, when we were told as Canadians by our political elites, by our elected officials, to basically stay home and refrain from going outside except when necessary, we all know them by heart now, we basically listened because of that higher trust. Now, this sort of sudden burst of trust and our ability to actually engage with each other as Canadians, saying that I'll do what I've been told to the extent that you do what you've been told as my neighbor, will have an impact on how we look at the brands and look at the people we engage with in our lives altogether. Sorry for that picture, maybe to some of you, but going into this COVID-19 crisis, even before we were actually asked to self-isolate, if I'm not a betting person, but if I told you, are you willing to bet $100 that in 6 weeks, 84% of Ontario residents would be satisfied with the work being done by their premier.
I wouldn't have taken that bet, Christian. I wouldn't have taken it.
My God, I'd be rich by now. And look at the Premier of Quebec. 91% of Quebecers are satisfied with the work that their Premier is doing. Elected with only, we mentioned it a second ago, elected by only 34% of Canadians just a few months back, 79% of people are satisfied with the work being done by the Prime Minister of Canada. I mean, these high levels of trust and sort of all of us coming together in and around our traditional institutions because they make sense in a time like this, will of course have an impact on how we relate to brand. Like, I strongly believe that moving forward, what Canadians will look for in brands is basically how our institutions have talked to us throughout this crisis. We will be looking for brands that are trusted, authentic, reliable, and I dare to say predictable in the future. This is what we will want to expect. Politically, the crisis favors the left. I mean, this has given us ideologically sort of a tap towards the left, and it's done so worldwide. So again, this whole sort of narrative of the collective, of sharing, will become extremely important, of caring for the community, and for some of us, handling sort of corporate sort of or community initiatives with our own brands, they will become more important in the months to come. Even business relationships will need to evolve to take account for that trust, that authenticity, that reliability that people will be looking for. So moving forward, saying you're the biggest or the best will not be enough. There's a dimension of trust in brands that people believe in to be trustworthy will become extremely important. Moving forward, I think it'll be, in terms of talking about your brand, it will not be so much about the daring as opposed to the sharing and the caring. I think it will have an impact on the words we use to describe who we are as service providers or makers of a product. Teleworking or working from home, it will be here to stay. 9% of Canadians were doing it for the very first time. 26% say they're doing it more often. Close to 50% are saying that they are working from home now during the crisis. And 79% of Canadians are satisfied with working from home. Now, that doesn't mean that people are not missing the office, missing the the chit chat around the coffee machine and the jokes in the office and the camaraderie and those very sort of brainstorming sessions where you need to be in the same room to be able to feel each other. Of course, there's some aspects of office life that we miss. And even though 79% of Canadians working from home say they're satisfied with working from home, 40% of them find that it's hard working from home. So there still are elements of technology that we need to fiddle around with so that presentations don't get cut off right in the middle with nobody knowing why. There are some things to be smoothed out when it comes to working from home, but it will be here to stay. I think a lot of people during this crisis are probably missing the office, but they're not missing the community, the commuting and other aspects of work. And when we're looking at sort of moving back towards or kickstarting our economy again, we see that about half of workers say that they want to go back to the office, not full time as like they used to, but will want to go back to the office. But yet 76% of Canadians who used to take public transit to work say they do not want to go back to work because they do not trust public transit right now. So employers will need to react, employees will need to adapt because working from home is here to stay. It will have an impact on many aspects of our economy as well, beyond just more people working from home. I think if you are in a fairly large city, there'll be, and you're looking for new office space, there'll be a lot of available square footage within a year or two from now, because people will be downsizing in terms of the size of office, and we'll be seeing a lot of those new workspace areas popping all over. Even us, as a market research firm, we still have a call center, Now, actually, all of our interviewers are actually calling Canadians from home. It's been working great. Why do we need those 60,000 square feet in downtown office space for a call center anymore? I mean, a lot of those decisions will need to be taken. It will have an impact, again, on those who are renting space in those downtown areas. It will have an impact on the food court downstairs, and it will also have an impact, for example, on the apparel industry. Of course, I do not know what you are wearing right now because I cannot see you, but I bet a lot of you are wearing something that you would not dare wear to the office. So if you're an apparel company, what's the size of that casual wear space that you will allow in your store as opposed to more sort of fancier power suit type? How will it affect how much we're buying in terms of apparel over the next few months or year or two? All of the impacts of more people working from home in a massive way still is hard to comprehend. As well, there are what I call broken rituals. If you are involved in all of my clients are other businesses, same as a lot of you, but coming out of this crisis, what will happen to the business, the traditional business meeting we used to have, where one gets in a cab or in the subway, then goes to the other for a meeting, and the meeting lasts 45 minutes, but it's taken 2 hours out of your workday? What will happen to that business meeting? What will happen to sort of that long day of back-to-back meetings where you have the feeling that you're not actually working? We've all been through those a million times. What will happen? What will happen to that day trip to Montreal, Toronto, or Calgary, where you hop on a plane at 6 o'clock in the morning and get home at around dinner time? Will those be as necessary as they used to be? And what happens to that business lunch that usually rarely makes a difference anyhow? What will happen to those moving into the future? I do believe that our way of doing business with each other will have changed. I've had to do business and accept contracts or give contracts away right now without ever seeing the person's face. And so far, it's been going great. So again, I think some things will change about how we engage other businesses as well. I think I've already talked too much about those sort of 10 trends that I see popping up that might have an impact on us moving into the next couple of years. If you want to learn more, of course, the second wave of our consumer behavior study will be available in about 5 to 7 business days. There'll be a third wave in June and then following. So we will see moving forward to what extent these new behaviors people are adopting are actually sticking with them. So be my guest if you want to know more about that study, and as well visit our website if you want to see all of our COVID research that's being published there. And lastly, since I always feel it's kind of cheesy to end presentations with a quote, here's mine. And really, this is about, again, this COVID-19 is simply about our capacity to adapt to change. So thank you, and I hope we still have time for questions.
Well, Christian, we don't have a lot of time for questions. We have 3 minutes left. A lot of people have asked if we're going to share this deck, and yes, we will. Christian has generously allowed us to share this with you. If there are any quick questions on the line in our 2 minutes left, I also invite people to get back in touch, drop me a note, drop Suzanne a note, want someone from our team with one of your questions, and we will follow up with Christian and definitely get the answer. Oh, yes, I have a question. Marina, please. Can we unmute Marina to ask her question?
Hi, I'm just wondering if you have a point of view on how transportation will change. Do you have a point of view on that?
Transportation in terms of how this might impact airline travel, for example?
Sorry, urban transportation, car transportation. What is this going to do to the car industry? Personally, I work in the motorcycle space, so leisure travel. So I'm just wondering if you have a point of view of what this might do for automotive.
Yeah, there might be a bit of a pushback again because of the thing people fear most coming out of COVID-19 right now is taking public transit. So I could easily see that car sharing services will actually pick up. You could see alternative ways of getting in and out of the downtown core could move. If I was selling scooters right now, I think this could be great for the summer for 2020 and 2021. I think it will take a long time, and it's probably one of the last behaviors people will want to engage in will be using public transit, at least for the next 6 months. This probably means a full summer of wanting to get around. A lot of people were already predicting sort of a couple of good years moving forward for both public transit and ride sharing. I believe this will be this still be true. Year 2020 was not heading to be a very good year for the automotive industry altogether. Not necessarily all that negative, but not all that great. So I think this may actually stop that downward curve because some people will be looking at alternatives to using public transit.
Thank you, Christian. Oh, another question, and this one's very near and dear to my heart, and Massimo Capra has asked this question. The restaurant industry, what are some of the trends and what are we seeing? Not the fast food or the Uber Eats or the take-in, but that connection that happens when you sit in a restaurant. What's going to happen to that dine-in experience?
Yeah, I've heard several things coming from the industry itself. Some say that in large cities, 1 out of every 2 restaurants may not actually make it through the current crisis. And it's certainly one of the last places of businesses that will open or fully open over the next few months. So this will be extremely difficult. I do trust, because eating out was actually a growing trend in Canada. And even if there's sort of people are pulling the elastic and sort of make your own in the other direction, I do believe that there will be a craving to socialize at the end of this crisis that might actually be positive for our restaurant industry. We might not go out, all 12 of us at the same time, but I think just this, actually it was very nice yesterday, and God, I wish there was a terrace where you could have had happy hour like we used to, right? So I think there'll be a craving for going back to these restaurants. There's some initiatives that I've seen as well. Right now, if you want to help restaurants here in Montreal, there's an application where you can buy some of their wines, and a $15 donations goes to helping those restaurants make it through the crisis. So it's a way, again, because our restaurant communities in our cities are very much part of the fabric of our cities and sort of the underground culture of our cities. So I believe there'll be a push to making sure that those survive. I'm not so sure about some of the family dining, those that were already having difficulties heading into the crisis. It probably will again accelerate the difficulties they were having. But for smaller independents who can make it through this crisis, I think they will be rewarded.
Thank you. One more, Justin, I see your question about staycation options. Do you want to unmute and ask your question? Justin Senior.
Yeah, hi. I was wondering, in terms of social distancing being a major impact going forward, how is that going to impact our options for choosing our staycations? Like where we're going to go, how we're going to treat our cottage? Are we going to be able to go to our cottages? Are people going to be able to go to local resorts that are around? Will there be options for us in 2020, 2021?
Yeah, that's again, I'm not the best. It's more our governments will tell us when it's safe to engage in those activities. I do believe, though, that summer 2020 there will be options available, but of course it'll happen in a context that will not be optimal. So that theater festival, that music festival, will not happen in the summer of 2020. But I think we will be available or capable to travel within our province or outside our province before the summer actually hits. But again, the service offering will not be optimal. I think for that we will need to wait until the spring of 2021, where festivals are back on. We hope by then festivals are back on, and that we have our best tourism offering available to Canadians. But I think the staycation is probably the only thing available for this summer. And we will be we will be able to actually engage in those activities.
Christian, everything you're saying is so riveting that I'm going to hold you for one more question that's been the burning question that I've got from everyone. And, you know, we've been hosting these webinars every week in Toronto and Montreal. And we started out and there were a lot about the crisis and dealing with the immediate urgency of it. But in the recent weeks, the question has very respectfully been when. When should brands start to communicate with their stakeholders in that authentic, you know, tone that's right for them? When is it okay to go beyond just the thoughts and prayers and into messaging?
Yeah, I think that I actually think that the thoughts and prayers thing is behind us now, and it will start to sound a little bit phony in not that long a time. I would actually think of stopping that in the next couple of weeks. And actually, there's also always a potential of that backfiring as well as a strategy. So I would move forward with my spring and summer, and already be sort of in that aftermath and sort of already be talking about maybe how this crisis has affected my service offering. That's all right. But here's who I am coming out of it. So the thoughts and prayers to me we should be on our last week or two of running those campaigns, I believe, before they start sounding a little bit off for a lot of Canadians.
And you think consumers are ready to hear our marketing messages and our attempts to connect?
Well, they're fresh air. I certainly believe we should. I mean, there's nothing against being aggressive as a marketer, even in these times. Quite the opposite.
Good. Okay, I don't see any other questions coming in. Suzanne, did you have any final thoughts?
No, I just wanted to thank you so much, Christian, for your time and for sharing all this really incredible data with us and with everybody today. I think there's great value that we can take away from here. As Tricia mentioned, we're going to be sharing the presentation with everybody afterwards. So don't worry if you didn't get every note written down. We'll share that with you guys. And we'll be sure to keep you posted on our next week's session as well. I mean, the goal with this is really, it's always been for us all to come together and share knowledge and connect and offer, you know, best practices. So we hope that everybody enjoyed and took away from today's session.
Well, thank you for having me. Hopefully it was useful.
Very, and if I could be so bold as to say, when the next round of research comes back, we'd love to have you again.
Oh, well, of course, we'll keep in touch.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye.
Wonderful.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everybody.
everybody.